Lonely rancher met the girl. No one noticed and said, "You make me want to stay." The autumn wind swept across the Wyoming plains with the kind of bite that warned of the brutal winter ahead. Jake Morrison pulled his worn hat lower over his eyes as he guided his horse through the main street of Cedar Creek, ignoring the whispered conversations that followed his rare appearances in town. 3 years had passed since anyone had seen him regularly, and the townspeople had grown accustomed to treating him like a ghost story, the hermit rancher who lived alone in the hills, speaking to no one except when absolutely necessary. Jake tied his horse outside Brennan's general store, his jaw set in the familiar line of grim determination that had become his permanent expression. The leather satchel slung across his shoulder contained the last of his savings, barely enough to cover the supplies he desperately needed. His ranch, once a thriving operation that his father had built from nothing, was slowly dying, and Jake knew he was the one killing it. The bell above the door chimed as he entered, and conversations immediately dropped to whispers. Jake moved through the narrow aisles with practiced efficiency, gathering flour, coffee, and the few other essentials he could afford. He'd learned to tune out the stares and murmured comments, but today something felt different. There was an electricity in the air, a sense of anticipation that made his skin crawl. Jake Morrison. The voice belonged to Samuel Brennan, the store owner whose family had run the establishment for 2 decades. "Been a while since we've seen you in town." Jake nodded curtly, placing his items on the counter. "Just need supplies, Sam." "Course you do." Brennan began tallying the purchases, his weathered fingers moving with practiced speed. "Heard you might be looking for help out at your place." The statement hung in the air like gun smoke. Jake's hands stilled on the counter. He hadn't told anyone about his situation, but in a town the size of Cedar Creek, secrets were rare commodities. Someone had clearly been talking, probably Martha Henderson, the banker's wife who seemed to know everyone's business before they knew it themselves. "Where'd you hear that?" Jake's voice carried a warning edge. "Doc Phillips mentioned you might need someone to help with getting things organized." Brennan's tone was carefully neutral. "Emma Walsh has been looking for extra work. She's good with numbers, reliable. Been helping her father keep his books straight since her mother passed." Jake had heard of Emma Walsh, though he couldn't conjure a clear picture of her face. She was one of those people who seemed to exist in the margins of town life, present but not particularly noticed. He vaguely remembered a thin woman with brown hair who worked behind the counter sometimes, always quiet, always efficient. "I don't need help," Jake said. But even as the words left his mouth, he knew they were a lie. His ranch was drowning in disorganization, unpaid bills, and the kind of neglect that came from a man who'd stopped caring about tomorrow. "Everyone needs help sometimes," Brennan said gently. "Emma's been taking care of her father since his accident last spring. She understands hard work and she understands keeping to herself. Might be exactly what you're looking for." Jake's first instinct was to reject the offer outright. He'd built his isolation carefully, like a fortress designed to keep the world at bay. The idea of someone invading his space, seeing the extent of his failure, made his stomach turn. But as he looked at the meager supplies on the counter, barely enough to last 2 weeks, he felt the familiar weight of desperation settling on his shoulders. "She'd need to stay at the ranch," he said finally. "Too far to ride back and forth every day, especially with winter coming. Emma's practical. She'd understand the arrangement." Brennan finished tallying the bill. "That'll be $12.60. Jake counted out the money, each coin representing another step closer to the edge of a cliff he'd been approaching for months. When he looked up, he caught sight of a woman emerging from the store's back room, carrying a crate of preserved goods. She was exactly as he'd half remembered, unremarkable in the way that made people's eyes slide past her without stopping. Brown hair pulled back in a practical bun, simple gray dress that had seen better days, and hands that moved with the efficiency of someone accustomed to hard work. Their eyes met for just a moment, and Jake was surprised by what he saw there. Intelligence, certainly, but also a kind of quiet strength that reminded him of the women who'd helped settle this territory, the ones who'd faced down blizzards and Indian raids without flinching. Emma Walsh might be easy to overlook, but she wasn't fragile. "Emma," Brennan called out, "come meet Jake Morrison." She approached with measured steps, and Jake found himself studying her more carefully. She was younger than he'd expected, probably in her early 20s, with the kind of pale skin that suggested she spent most of her time indoors. But her handshake was firm, And when she looked at him, she didn't flinch away from his scarred face or the hardness in his eyes. "Mr. Morrison," she said simply, "I understand you might have work available." "Maybe." Jake found himself appreciating her directness. It'd be ranch work, bookkeeping, organizing supplies, that sort of thing. Pay wouldn't be much, and you'd need to stay out there during the week. "I can do that." Emma's response was immediate, without hesitation. "When would you need me to start?" Jake studied her face, looking for signs of the curiosity or pity that usually accompanied people's interactions with him. He found neither. Emma Walsh looked at him the way she might look at a business transaction, with interest in the practical details but no apparent desire to dig into his personal history. "Monday morning," he said. "Be ready for hard work and long days." "It's not a social call." "I wouldn't expect it to be." Emma's slight smile transformed her face, revealing a warmth that had been hidden beneath her practical exterior. "I'll be there at sunrise." As Jake left the store, he caught fragments of conversation following him into the street. The townspeople were already speculating about his decision to hire help, wondering what it meant for the hermit rancher who'd shut himself away after tragedy struck. He ignored them, as he always did, but something had shifted in the careful balance of his isolation. The ride back to his ranch took him through familiar territory, rolling hills covered in autumn grass, distant mountains that would soon be white with snow, and the endless sky that had once filled him with a sense of possibility. Now it felt like a weight pressing down on his shoulders, a reminder of how small and insignificant his problems were in the face of such vastness. His ranch house came into view as the sun began to set, painting the weathered wood in shades of gold and amber. It had been a beautiful place once when his wife Sarah had filled it with laughter, and his young son had run through the rooms like a small tornado. Now it felt like a mausoleum, filled with memories he couldn't escape and couldn't bear to face. Jake unsaddled his horse and headed toward the house, his mind already turning to the practical challenges ahead. Having Emma Walsh at the ranch would mean confronting the full extent of his neglect. The unpaid bills, the disorganized records, the gradual decay that had set in when he'd stopped caring about maintaining anything beyond basic survival. But as he looked at the empty windows of his house, he felt something he hadn't experienced in years. Anticipation, not hope. He wasn't ready for anything that dangerous, but a sense that Monday morning might bring something different from the endless repetition of solitary days that had defined his existence. The wind picked up as he reached the porch, carrying with it the scent of approaching winter and the promise of changes he wasn't sure he was ready to face. But for the first time in 3 years, Jake Morrison found himself looking forward to tomorrow, instead of simply enduring it. Emma Walsh stood at her bedroom window, watching the first light of dawn creep across the horizon. Her single carpetbag sat packed beside the door, containing everything she'd need for her stay at the Morrison Ranch. She'd been awake for hours, her mind racing through the practical details of what lay ahead, but underneath her careful planning ran a current of nervous energy she couldn't quite name. The Walsh home was a modest 2-room cabin on the outskirts of Cedar Creek, built by her father during the early days of settlement. It had never been much to look at, but Emma had worked hard to make it comfortable, mending the curtains her mother had sewn, keeping the floors scrubbed clean, and maintaining the small vegetable garden that helped stretch their meager income. Now, as she prepared to leave her father in the care of their neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, she felt the familiar weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders. "You don't have to do this, Emma." Her father's voice came from the main room, where he sat propped up in the chair that had become his permanent residence since the accident that had crushed his leg. Thomas Walsh had been a proud man once, working as a blacksmith until a spooked horse had left him with a limp and hands that shook too much for detailed work. "There's got to be other ways to make ends meet." Emma turned from the window, her expression gentle but determined. "There aren't, Papa. You know that as well as I do. The store work barely covers our rent, and with winter coming..." She let the sentence hang unfinished. They both knew how precarious their situation had become. But Morrison's place? "Emma, that man's been living like a wild animal for years. Nobody knows what goes on out there." Thomas's weathered face creased with worry. "What if he's dangerous? What if..." "He's not dangerous, Papa. He's just hurt." Emma had given this considerable thought since accepting the position. She'd heard all the stories about Jake Morrison, how he'd lost his family in a fire, how he'd retreated from civilization, how he'd become something of a local legend. But she'd also seen something in his eyes during their brief meeting, a recognition of pain that matched her own intimate knowledge of loss. "You always see the good in people just like your mother did." Thomas's voice softened. "But sometimes that kindness can put you in harm's way." Emma knelt beside her father's chair, taking his gnarled hands in hers. "I'll be careful, I promise. But Papa, this is our chance. If I can help him get his affairs in order, prove that I'm capable of more than just store work, maybe other opportunities will come along. Maybe I can build something better for both of us." Thomas studied his daughter's face, seeing the determined set of her jaw that reminded him so much of her mother. Emma had been the invisible one in their family, the quiet daughter who'd never caused trouble, never demanded attention, never complained about the hand life had dealt her. She'd simply endured, adapting to each new hardship with the same steady grace that had carried her through 22 years of being overlooked by a world that valued beauty and boldness over quiet competence. "You're stronger than you know, Emma Walsh," he said finally. "Just promise me you'll come home if things get difficult." "I promise." Emma kissed his forehead, then gathered her bag and headed for the door. "Mrs. Patterson will check on you twice a day, and I'll be back Friday evening to see how you're managing." The ride to the Morrison Ranch took Emma through country she'd rarely seen, despite having lived in Cedar Creek her entire life. The road, little more than a wagon track, wound through hills covered in autumn grass that rustled in the morning breeze. The landscape was beautiful but lonely, with vast stretches of emptiness that seemed to swallow sound and movement alike. As she guided her father's old mare up a particularly steep rise, Emma found herself thinking about the decision that had brought her here. She'd spent her entire life in the margins, watching other people live their stories while she remained safely invisible. Working at Brennan's store had been comfortable precisely because it required nothing of her beyond basic competence. She could stock shelves, handle transactions, and maintain the books without ever having to step forward into the light of attention. But comfort, Emma was beginning to realize, was its own kind of prison. She'd watched her contemporaries marry and start families, pursue dreams and take risks while she'd remained frozen in place by her own fear of being found wanting. The Morrison Ranch job represented something different, a chance to prove, if only to herself, that she was capable of more than mere survival. The ranch house came into view as she crested the final hill, and Emma's first impression was of abandonment. The building itself was solid, good bones, as her father would have said, but it showed the unmistakable signs of neglect. Paint peeled from the shutters. The front porch sagged slightly under the weight of accumulated debris, and the entire property had an air of desolation that spoke of dreams deferred and hopes abandoned. Jake Morrison emerged from the barn as she approached, and Emma felt her breath catch slightly. In town, surrounded by the familiar bustle of commerce and conversation, he'd seemed merely intimidating. Here, against the backdrop of his own domain, he looked like something carved from the landscape itself, weathered, permanent, and utterly alone. "You came," he said simply, as if her arrival had been genuinely in doubt. "I said I would." Emma dismounted, her movements economical and precise. "Where would you like me to start?" Jake studied her for a long moment, perhaps surprised by her directness. "House first, I suppose. Books and papers are in the worst shape." He gestured toward the building with something approaching embarrassment. "Fair warning, it's not fit for company." Emma followed him up the porch steps, noting the way he moved with careful deliberation, as if he were navigating through a minefield of memories. When he opened the front door, she understood why he'd warned her. The interior of the house was a monument to neglect and grief. Papers were scattered across every surface. Dishes sat unwashed in the sink, and a thick layer of dust covered furniture that had obviously once been well made and carefully maintained. But underneath the chaos, Emma could see the bones of what had been a real home. Family photographs still hung on the walls. A woman's touch was evident in the choice of curtains and the arrangement of rooms, and everywhere there were signs of interrupted life. "I know it's bad," Jake said, his voice tight with defensive anger. "If you want to change your mind." "It's not bad," Emma interrupted, setting down her bag with determined finality. "It's just neglected. There's a difference." She moved through the main room with the eye of someone accustomed to bringing order from chaos. The task ahead was daunting, certainly, but not impossible. What struck her most was not the disarray but the evidence of love that still lingered in small details. A child's drawing stuck to the kitchen wall, a woman's shawl draped over a chair, a man's pipe still sitting on the mantelpiece as if waiting for its owner to return. Where did they? Emma began, then stopped herself. She'd come here to work, not to pry into Jake Morrison's personal tragedy. Fire, Jake said flatly. 3 years ago, they were visiting Sarah's sister in town when it happened. Lightning struck the hotel where they were staying. His voice carried no emotion, but Emma could see the cost of those words in the rigid line of his shoulders. I was here, working on repairs to the barn roof. By the time I got to town, there was nothing left to save. Emma turned to face him, her heart clenching at the devastation she saw in his eyes. She'd known loss. Her mother's death 2 years earlier had left a hole in their family that nothing could fill, but she couldn't imagine the scale of Jake's grief. To lose everything in a single moment, to have your entire future erased by a random act of nature, was beyond her comprehension. I'm sorry, she said simply, and Jake looked at her with surprise. Most people, when they offered condolences, seemed to expect something in return: acknowledgement, gratitude, or at least engagement with their sympathy. Emma's words carried no such expectation. They were simply what they appeared to be, an acknowledgement of his pain. Yeah, well, Jake cleared his throat, clearly uncomfortable with the moment of vulnerability. That's why the books are such a mess. Haven't much cared about keeping track of things. Emma nodded, understanding more than he probably realized. She'd seen the same kind of neglect in her own home after her mother's death, the way grief could paralyze even the most basic functions of daily life. The difference was that she'd had her father to care for, a responsibility that had forced her to keep moving even when she'd wanted to stop. I'll start with the financial records, she said, moving toward the desk where papers lay scattered like fallen leaves. Get a clear picture of where things stand, then we can work on the rest. Jake watched her begin to sort through the chaos, her movements efficient and purposeful. There was something almost hypnotic about the way she worked, bringing order to disorder with the same quiet competence she'd displayed in the store. For the first time in years, Jake found himself wondering what it would be like to have someone share the burden of simply existing. I'll be working outside, he said finally. Call if you need anything. Emma looked up from the papers, her brown eyes meeting his with unexpected warmth. Thank you for trusting me with this. Jake left the house feeling strangely unsettled. He'd expected awkwardness, perhaps even regret at allowing someone into his private space. Instead, he found himself thinking about the gentle certainty in Emma's voice, the way she'd looked at his ruined home and seen possibility instead of hopelessness. It was a dangerous feeling, that flicker of something that might have been hope. As he headed toward the barn, Jake Morrison couldn't shake the feeling that Monday morning had brought more than just help with his bookkeeping. It had brought the first real change in his carefully constructed world of isolation, and he wasn't sure whether that terrified him or filled him with anticipation. 2 weeks had passed since Emma Walsh arrived at the Morrison Ranch, and the transformation was undeniable. The house that had once felt like a tomb now showed signs of life. Clean windows that let in the autumn light, organized papers that revealed the true state of Jake's finances, and meals that filled the kitchen with aromas he'd almost forgotten existed. Emma had established a routine that respected Jake's need for solitude, while gradually chipping away at the walls he'd built around himself. She rose before dawn to prepare breakfast, spent her mornings tackling the overwhelming paperwork, and used her afternoons to restore order to rooms that had been abandoned to dust and memory. In the evenings, she would sit on the front porch with her mending, her presence a quiet comfort that Jake found himself looking forward to, despite his best efforts to maintain emotional distance. The financial picture she'd uncovered was grim but not hopeless. Jake's debts were substantial. 3 years of neglect had accumulated into a mountain of unpaid bills, overdue taxes, and creditors who were growing impatient. But the ranch itself was valuable, and Emma had identified several opportunities to generate income that Jake's grief-clouded judgment had overlooked. You've got 40 head of cattle ready for market, she said over breakfast on a crisp October morning, her ledger spread beside her plate. If we can get them to the railroad in Cheyenne before the heavy snows hit, that'll cover most of what you owe on the banknote. Jake looked up from his coffee, surprised as always by her practical grasp of ranch economics. It's a hard drive to Cheyenne. Takes experienced hands. Then we hire experienced hands. Emma's tone was matter-of-fact, as if the solution were obvious. Tom Bradley's been looking for work since the Henderson place let him go. He knows cattle, and he knows the trail. That costs money I don't have. You'll have it once you sell the cattle. Emma's patient smile reminded Jake of a schoolteacher explaining basic arithmetic to a stubborn student. Sometimes you have to spend money to make money. Jake found himself studying her face, noting the way her eyes lit up when she discussed business matters. In town, Emma Walsh had been invisible, a quiet presence who blended into the background of daily commerce. Here, freed from the constraints of other people's expectations, she revealed a sharp intelligence and natural head for business that impressed him despite himself. "You should have been running your own operation," he said impulsively, "instead of working for other people." Emma's smile faltered slightly, and for a moment Jake saw something vulnerable in her expression. "Women like me don't get to run things, Mr. Morrison. We just help other people run theirs." "Women like you?" "Plain women. Quiet women. Women who don't make men think about romance and marriage." Emma's voice carried no self-pity, just the weary acceptance of someone who'd learned to live with society's limitations. "I've made my peace with that." Jake felt an unexpected surge of anger on her behalf. Any man who can't see past a pretty face to recognize real value is a fool. The words hung in the air between them, more intimate than anything either had intended. Emma looked down at her hands, color rising in her cheeks, while Jake cursed himself for the slip in his carefully maintained emotional distance. "I should get back to the books," Emma said quietly, rising from the table with her characteristic efficiency. "Emma." Jake's voice stopped her at the doorway. "I meant what I said." She looked back at him, her brown eyes wide with something that might have been hope. "Thank you." That afternoon, Jake found himself working closer to the house than usual, ostensibly checking the fence line, but actually watching Emma through the kitchen window as she continued her methodical restoration of his home. She moved with unconscious grace, her simple dress and practical apron somehow more appealing than the elaborate fashions worn by the town's acknowledged beauties. The realization that he was attracted to Emma Walsh hit him like a physical blow. For 3 years he'd convinced himself that part of his life was over, that the capacity for desire had died with his wife and son. The stirring of interest he felt watching Emma work was both unwelcome and undeniable, a betrayal of the grief that had defined his existence. "Mr. Morrison?" Emma's voice from the porch interrupted his brooding. "You have a visitor." Jake looked up to see a familiar figure riding up the ranch road, Samuel Brennan, his weathered face set in lines of concern. The store owner dismounted slowly, his movements careful with the stiffness that came from years of physical labor. "Sam?" Jake's greeting was neutral, but internally he braced himself for bad news. Brennan rarely made social calls, and his presence here meant something significant had happened in town. "Jake, Miss Walsh." Brennan tipped his hat to Emma, then fixed his attention on Jake. "I'm afraid I've got some troubling news. Word's gotten around about your financial situation, and there's been talk." "What kind of talk?" "The kind that comes from vultures circling a wounded animal." Brennan's expression was grim. "Chester Hawthorne's been making inquiries about your property. Seems he's got his eye on expanding his holdings, and he's heard you might be motivated to sell." Jake felt his blood run cold. Chester Hawthorne was the wealthiest man in 3 counties, a railroad investor whose idea of business involved acquiring land through foreclosure and intimidation. If Hawthorne was circling, it meant Jake's financial troubles were common knowledge, and that his time was running out. "How much time do I have?" Jake asked. "Banknotes due in 6 weeks, Brennan said. "If you can't meet it, Hawthorne will be first in line to snap up the property for a fraction of its value." Emma stepped forward, her ledger clutched in her hands. "What about the cattle drive? If we can get them to market." "That's a big if, Miss Walsh." Brennan's tone was respectful but realistic. "Winter's coming early this year. Weather could turn any day now, and once the snows hit, those cattle won't be worth anything until spring." Jake felt the familiar weight of despair settling on his shoulders. For a brief moment, Emma's presence and quiet efficiency had made him believe that recovery was possible. Now, faced with the harsh reality of his situation, he remembered why he'd given up hope in the first place. "Maybe selling is the right choice," he said quietly. "This place has nothing but bad memories anyway." "That's not true." Emma's voice carried surprising strength. "This place has love in it. I can see it in every room, every detail. Your wife and son, they made this a home. That's not something you can just walk away from." Jake looked at her, seeing the passion in her eyes, the fierce determination that had been hiding beneath her quiet exterior. Emma, you don't understand. I've lost everything once. I can't. You haven't lost everything. Emma moved closer, her small hands reaching out to touch his arm. You're still here. You're still fighting even if you don't realize it. And sometimes, when we think we've lost everything, that's when we find what we really need. The moment stretched between them, charged with possibilities that neither was quite ready to acknowledge. Jake felt something shift inside him, a crack in the wall of grief and isolation that had protected him for so long. Emma Walsh, the woman no one noticed, was seeing him in a way that made him remember who he used to be. I'll organize the cattle drive, he said finally, but I'll need help. You'll have it. Emma's smile was radiant, transforming her face completely. We'll make this work, Mr. Morrison. I promise you that. As Brennan rode away, Jake found himself standing beside Emma on the porch, watching the sun set over the hills that had been his sanctuary and his prison. The challenges ahead were enormous, the odds stacked against them. But for the first time in years, Jake Morrison felt something that might have been hope. Why are you doing this? He asked quietly. Why do you care what happens to me? Emma was quiet for a long moment, her gaze fixed on the horizon. Because you're the first person who's ever looked at me and seen something worth saving, she said finally. And because I think maybe we can save each other. Jake felt his heart clench at the simple honesty in her words. Emma Walsh might be the woman no one noticed, but she was also the woman who'd walked into his broken life and started putting the pieces back together. As the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, Jake Morrison began to believe that maybe, just maybe, he'd found something worth fighting for after all. The wind picked up, carrying with it the scent of approaching winter and the promise of challenges ahead. But for the first time in 3 years, Jake wasn't facing those challenges alone. Beside him stood a woman who'd chosen to see possibility where others saw only failure, and in her quiet strength he was beginning to find his own. The cattle drive began before dawn on a November morning that promised to be the last clear day before winter's arrival. Jake sat his horse at the edge of the herd, watching as Tom Bradley and 2 hired hands worked to get the 40 head of cattle moving toward the trail that would take them to Cheyenne. The air was sharp with the promise of snow, and dark clouds gathered on the northern horizon like an advancing army. Emma stood on the porch, her shawl wrapped tightly around her shoulders, watching the organized chaos of the departure. She'd spent the previous evening going over the financial calculations one more time, her careful figures showing that success would mean survival, while failure would mean the end of everything Jake had left. The weight of responsibility sat heavily on her shoulders, but beneath the anxiety ran a current of fierce determination. You sure about this? Tom Bradley called out, his weathered face creased with concern as he surveyed the threatening sky. Looks like weather's moving in faster than expected. Jake felt the familiar knot of fear tighten in his stomach. 3 years of isolation had eroded his confidence in his own judgment, and the stakes couldn't be higher. But then he caught sight of Emma's face, serene and trusting, and felt something inside him steady. We go, he said firmly. This is our chance. The drive began smoothly, with the cattle following the familiar rhythm of the trail. Jake rode point, his experienced eye reading the landscape and weather signs that would determine their success or failure. The hired hands worked with quiet efficiency, their movements coordinated by years of shared experience on similar drives. For a few hours, Jake allowed himself to hope that everything would go according to plan. The first snow began falling just after noon, light flakes that seemed almost playful as they danced in the wind. But Jake had lived in Wyoming long enough to recognize the deceptive nature of such gentle beginnings. Within an hour, the flakes had grown heavier, and the wind had picked up enough to sting exposed skin. We need to find shelter, Bradley shouted over the increasing howl of the wind. There's a line cabin about 5 miles ahead. If we can get there. His words were cut off by a crack of thunder that sent the cattle into a panic. What had been an orderly procession suddenly became a chaotic stampede, with 40 head of terrified animals scattering in all directions. Jake spurred his horse forward, his rope already in hand, trying to turn the leaders back toward the herd. But the combination of thunder, lightning, and driving snow had transformed the animals into a force of nature that defied human control. For the next 3 hours, Jake and his crew fought to regather the scattered cattle, while the storm intensified around them. The temperature dropped rapidly, and the snow began to accumulate with alarming speed. By the time they'd managed to collect most of the herd, the trail had become nearly impassable. We've lost at least 10 head, Bradley reported, his voice tight with frustration. They scattered into the breaks country. We'll never find them in this weather. Jake stared at the remaining cattle, his mind calculating losses that would make the difference between salvation and ruin. 10 head represented nearly a quarter of his expected income, enough to tip the balance from success to failure. The dream of saving his ranch was slipping away with each falling snowflake. We could try to wait it out, one of the hired hands suggested. Storm might blow through by morning. Or it might last 3 days, Bradley countered. We're burning daylight and the trail's going to be impassable if this keeps up. Jake sat his horse in the swirling snow, paralyzed by the magnitude of the decision before him. Push forward and risk losing everything to the storm, or turn back and accept defeat. Either choice carried the potential for disaster, and the weight of Emma's faith in him made the decision even more agonizing. Then through the storm he heard something that made his blood run cold, the sound of a horse approaching at a gallop. A rider emerged from the snow, and Jake's heart nearly stopped when he recognized Emma's slight figure bent low over her father's mare. "Emma!" Jake spurred his horse toward her, his voice carrying a mix of relief and fury. "What are you doing here? It's not safe." Emma pulled up beside him, her face flushed with cold and exertion. "I brought news," she said breathlessly. "Chester Hawthorne came to the ranch an hour after you left. He's filed a claim-jumping petition with the territorial court, saying you've abandoned the property." The words hit Jake like a physical blow. Claim-jumping was a legal maneuver that allowed speculators to seize property they claimed had been abandoned by its owners. If Hawthorne could convince a judge that Jake's absence during the cattle drive constituted abandonment, he could take the ranch without waiting for the foreclosure. "He can't do that," Jake said. But even as he spoke, he knew how naive the words sounded. Chester Hawthorne had enough money and influence to bend the law to his will, especially when it came to a hermit rancher with few friends and fewer resources. "He can if you're not there to contest it," Emma said urgently. "The hearing is scheduled for tomorrow morning. If you don't appear, he wins by default." Jake stared at her, his mind reeling with the implications. To save his ranch, he'd have to abandon the cattle drive that represented his only hope of raising enough money to pay his debts. But to save his investment, he'd have to let Hawthorne steal his land. It was an impossible choice, a trap designed to ensure his failure no matter what he decided. "Go back," he said finally. "I'll figure something out." "No." Emma's voice carried a strength that surprised him. "We'll figure something out. Together." Tom Bradley rode up to join them, his face grim as he assessed the situation. "Storm's getting worse," he reported. "We need to make a decision soon, or we're going to lose more than just cattle." Jake looked at the remnants of his herd, then at Emma's determined face, and felt something shift inside him. For 3 years he'd been trying to hold on to the past, to preserve the remnants of a life that had been destroyed by forces beyond his control. But Emma hadn't come here to help him preserve the past. She'd come to help him build a future. "Turn them back," he said suddenly. "We're going home." "Jake." "No," Emma protested. "The money. There'll be other ways to raise money." Jake's voice carried a conviction that surprised him. "But there's only one ranch and I'm not losing it to a vulture like Hawthorne." The ride back to the ranch was a nightmare of wind and snow, with the cattle moving reluctantly through increasingly treacherous conditions. By the time they reached the relative shelter of the home pasture, night had fallen and the storm had reached full intensity. Jake dismissed the hired hands with promises of payment when he could manage it, then helped Emma get the horses settled in the barn. "I'm sorry," Emma said, as they stood in the warm shelter, brushing snow from their clothes. "I should have found another way to get word to you. You did exactly what you needed to do." Jake looked at her, seeing the exhaustion and worry in her face, and felt his heart clench with an emotion he wasn't ready to name. "Emma, I need to tell you something." She looked up at him, her brown eyes wide with anticipation. "When I hired you, I thought I was just getting help with the books, but you've given me something more important than that." Jake's voice was rough with emotion. "You've reminded me what it feels like to have something worth fighting for." Emma's breath caught, and for a moment neither of them spoke. The barn was warm and quiet around them, insulated from the storm outside, and Jake felt as if they were the only two people in the world. "I need to tell you something too," Emma said quietly. "I didn't come here just for the work. I came because I was tired of being invisible, tired of living in the shadows of other people's lives. You make me feel like I matter. Jake reached out to touch her face, his rough fingers gentle against her skin. You do matter. You matter more than you know. The kiss that followed was soft and tentative, a question asked and answered without words. When they finally broke apart, Emma was smiling through tears she hadn't realized she was shedding. What happens now? She asked. Now we fight, Jake said firmly. We go to town tomorrow and face down Hawthorne. We find other ways to raise money. We build something together. Emma looked at him, seeing the man she'd fallen in love with beneath the layers of grief and isolation. Together? If you'll have me, Jake said. I know I'm not much of a catch. Broken down rancher with more debts than assets. But Emma, you make me want to stay. You make me want to fight for tomorrow instead of just surviving today. Emma's smile was radiant, transforming her face completely. Yes, she said simply. Yes to all of it. Outside, the storm raged on. But inside the barn, two people who had found each other against all odds, held each other close and planned for a future that suddenly seemed possible. The challenges ahead were enormous. The odds still stacked against them, but they would face them together. The next morning dawned clear and cold, with the storm having blown itself out during the night. Jake and Emma rode into town together, their horses' hooves crunching through the fresh snow. The territorial courthouse was crowded with curious onlookers, drawn by the spectacle of Chester Hawthorne's latest land grab. But Jake Morrison was no longer the broken hermit who'd hidden away from the world. Walking into that courtroom with Emma Walsh by his side, he was a man who'd found something worth fighting for. And as the judge called the hearing to order, Jake Morrison squared his shoulders and prepared to fight for the future he and Emma would build together. The woman no one had noticed had seen something in him worth saving, and in return he'd found the courage to see himself as worthy of love. Whatever happened next, they would face it together, the lonely rancher and the woman who'd made him want to stay. What did you think of Jake and Emma's incredible journey from loneliness to love? Did their story touch your heart the way it touched ours? We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Tell us your favorite moment from their tale, or share if you've ever felt invisible like Emma or isolated like Jake. If you enjoyed this emotional story of two souls finding each other against all odds, please give this video a thumbs up and subscribe to our channel for more heartwarming stories from the American frontier. Your support helps us bring you more tales of love, courage, and the unbreakable human spirit. Don't forget to ring that notification bell so you never miss our latest uploads. Thank you for joining us on this unforgettable journey.